In the brutal winter of 1886, deep in the Montana Territory, where the Bitterroot Mountains meet endless pine forests, a trapper named Isaac Turner became the laughingstock of the entire valley. Men who'd spent decades surviving those mountains gathered at the trading post and shook their heads at what Turner was building. They called it foolishness, a waste of good timber, the desperate idea of a man who'd lost his senses. What none of them could know was that in less than 3 months, the structure they were mocking would be the only thing standing between life and death when temperatures dropped to 63 degrees below zero, and their own cabins would become little more than wooden coffins, slowly filling with ice. Isaac Turner had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, a carpenter in his early 30s, running from a life that had grown too small. He'd worked building fine homes back east, but needed to test himself against something that wouldn't forgive mistakes. The mountains gave him that. He'd started trapping beaver and marten along the Clark Fork River tributaries, learning that 30 miles from the nearest settlement, you survived by watching and thinking, not by following tradition blindly. His closest neighbors were the Bridger brothers, whose cabin sat a hard day's ride south, and Thomas Weatherby, a former soldier about 15 miles northeast. Beyond that, nothing but wilderness and the kind of silence that makes a man either wise or mad. Everyone in the territory built cabins the same way. Notch logs, stack them, chink the gaps with moss and mud, build the biggest fireplace you could manage, and pray you'd cut enough wood. Turner had built his first shelter that way, spending his first winter feeding an enormous hearth day and night, watching his wood disappear like snow in sunlight. He'd burned through nearly 3 cords in a single month, his hands raw from endless splitting. The cabin had been survivable barely, but it taught him something. Traditional didn't mean efficient, it just meant familiar. On the coldest nights, when he'd exhausted himself keeping the fire roaring, he'd sometimes retreat to the farthest corner, pile every blanket into a small space, and notice it stayed warmer than the entire cabin with its massive fire. The smaller the space, the warmer it stayed. The more layers between him and the cold, the less work it took. It was simple observation, the kind that seems obvious once you notice it, but it sparked something. What if a shelter was built from the beginning around these principles? That spring, he'd tried explaining his idea to Thomas Weatherby. He'd used words like layers and concentrated heat and small spaces, but Weatherby had looked at him like he'd suggested building from snow. The Bridger brothers had laughed outright when he mentioned it, but Turner couldn't let it go. By early September, with the first frosts coming, he'd made his decision. He was going to build something different, something that would probably make him look like the biggest fool in Montana Territory. If he was wrong, he'd waste months of work and face winter in a failed experiment with no backup. But that same drive that brought him west needed to know if he was right. Word spread fast in a territory where neighbors were separated by days, but news moved like wind through the pines. By October, Turner's name was being mentioned around every campfire within 50 miles. Not with respect, with pity and contempt. When he ran into trappers during a supply trip, they'd asked about the crazy structure they'd heard he was building. He'd tried to explain using his observations, the logic that seemed so clear. They'd listened with patience you'd give a child. One grey-bearded man named McCulloch, who'd survived more winters than Turner had been alive, put a hand on his shoulder and said if things got desperate come January, Turner was welcome to shelter with them. The message was clear. They expected him to fail, maybe even to die. His own doubts crept in during lonely evenings. Maybe generations of frontiersmen built cabins the traditional way for a reason. Maybe his observations meant nothing compared to all that experience. But then he'd remember that first winter, the exhaustion, the constant fear of running out of wood, and he'd pick up his tools again. Turner started work in mid-September, when weather still allowed long days of labour. Instead of the standard rectangular cabin, he'd build a pyramid, 4 sloping walls meeting at a point about 20 feet above ground. But the real innovation was the layering. He'd create a double wall with a gap running all around, filled with insulating material. The inner chamber would be small, concentrated around a modest central hearth. Every element had a reason, drawn from simple observation about how warmth behaved. He'd watched how root cellars stayed cool by being underground with thick walls. He'd noticed native people sometimes use double-layer construction. He'd observed that the biggest cabins weren't always the warmest. None of this was theory. It was paying attention to what worked, then combining those lessons in a way no one else had thought to try. The first task was timber. Over 3 weeks, working alone from first light to dusk, he felled close to 40 trees, dragging each by horse to his building site. The work was brutal. His shoulders ached constantly, hands developing new blisters that hardened into tougher skin. He averaged maybe 3 trees a day when things went well. The sound of his axe echoed through the valley, and he knew that sound was evidence of his supposed madness. By early October, he began actual construction. The base was a square, about 12 feet per side, cornerstones set on flat rocks. Then came the real challenge, creating the slope. Each wall had to angle inward at the same rate, meeting at the apex in a way that would support weight and shed snow. He'd learned about angles during his carpentry days, but this was different, more intuitive, using notches and friction and gravity rather than precise measurements. The structure rose through October, taking shape in a way that confirmed every criticism. It looked strange. Where their cabins were solid rectangles of stacked logs, his pyramid grew like something from another world. When the Bridger brothers rode by in late October, they sat on their horses just staring. Charlie said, trying to be diplomatic, that it sure was different. Frank was more direct, asking if Turner had given thought to where he'd shelter when this thing collapsed under the first heavy snow. They'd meant it kindly, but Turner felt the sting. He simply nodded and returned to work, hands moving on logs while doubt gnawed at him. He'd wanted to explain that the slope was the point, that snow would slide off, that the pyramid shape was stronger for distributing weight, but explaining only made the mockery worse. Better to let the structure speak for itself. Through late October and November, as first snows began, Turner completed the outer wall and began the critical phase, the inner structure. He built a second pyramid inside the first, creating that gap he'd envisioned. The space between varied from about a foot at the base to half that at head height. Into this gap, he packed everything that might stop cold air. Dry moss from tree trunks, thick as wool, pine needles by the bushel from the forest floor, dried grass from a meadow 2 miles distant. The work was tedious and probably looked insane. He'd imagine how it appeared. A grown man stuffing a bizarre structure with forest debris. But he'd remembered how a coat worked, not because fabric itself was warm, but because it trapped air. That's what he was building, a giant coat around his living space. When Thomas Weatherby stopped by in mid-November to check if Turner needed help before real winter, he'd stood looking at the pyramid with something between concern and disbelief. He'd asked whether all that plant material might draw mice, or rot, or catch fire. Turner had considered all of it, but explaining felt pointless. Weatherby left after extracting a promise that Turner would signal if he needed help. A promise they both knew was really an invitation to give up before it was too late. By late November, with snow falling regularly and temperatures dropping well below freezing, Turner finished the interior. It was small, perhaps 10 feet square at the base, tapering upward to a smoke hole at the apex. The hearth sat centre, a circular pit lined with creek stones, with a chimney effect that would draw smoke up while radiating heat in all directions. Around this he'd built a raised sleeping platform, storage shelves and basic amenities. The entire living space could have fit inside a standard cabin's main room with space to spare. But that was the point. Less space meant less air to heat. Warmth concentrated where it mattered. He'd also created a small entrance tunnel, angled to prevent wind from blowing directly in, with a heavy hide door at the inner end. Another layer, another barrier. When he finally stood inside the completed structure, looking up at the peak 20 feet above, feeling how the space embraced rather than sprawled, he felt something shift. This might actually work, or it might be the most elaborate grave anyone had ever built. He'd know soon enough. The first real test came in early December, when a storm from Canada dropped temperatures into the single digits for nearly a week. Turner built a modest fire in his central hearth and waited. Within an hour, the inner chamber warmed to where he could move comfortably in a single layer. The walls held that warmth, the gap with its insulating material doing exactly what he'd hoped. He maintained the small fire, adding a piece every hour or so, and temperature stayed steady. Meanwhile, his neighbours were feeding enormous fireplaces constantly, burning through wood at a rate that made supplies a constant worry. When the storm broke, he'd used maybe a third of the wood he would have needed in a traditional cabin. The difference was noticeable enough that he stood looking at his modest wood pile, feeling the first real vindication. But December in Montana wasn't real winter. That was still coming. The old-timers all said so, reading signs in animal fur thickness, the way ravens behaved, the particular quality of the northern sky. Something bad was building, something that would make December's cold seem mild as spring. Understanding why it worked didn't require engineering education. The double wall created stillness. Outside, wind might be howling, but in that gap, air sat trapped and quiet. Still air was one of the best insulators. The moss and needles made it even more still, breaking it into countless tiny pockets. Heat from the fire, and his body warmed the inner wall. That warmth couldn't easily escape through layers of trapped still air to the outer wall, like wearing a heavy coat rather than a thin shirt. The coat didn't create heat. It prevented heat from escaping. The pyramid shape helped. Heat rises naturally, and sloping walls guided that rising heat along their surface, heating them evenly rather than letting warmth pool uselessly against a flat ceiling. The central hearth meant heat radiated equally in all directions. The small space meant his modest fire was heating perhaps a fifth of the volume a traditional cabin demanded. And because less heat escaped, the fire could be smaller, which meant less wood, less work hauling and splitting, more energy for other survival tasks. None of this was complicated. Just observation turned into structure. A root cellar stayed cool because thick walls and earth insulated it from summer heat. His pyramid stayed warm because thick walls and trapped air insulated it from winter cold. Same principle, different application. By late December, veterans were reading the weather with unease. Thomas Weatherby mentioned that the Blackfeet were saying this would be a winter spoken about for generations. The Bridger brothers had doubled their usual woodpile. At the settlement, Families were preparing as if for a siege. The signs were everywhere. Elk had moved to the lowest valleys unusually early. Bears had denned weeks ahead of normal. Ravens had gathered in enormous flocks and pushed south. Even the trees seemed to know. Their sap pulled deep, branches brittle as glass. Turner watched these signs too, feeling tension building in the very air, and increased his preparations. He hauled more wood, though nothing like what traditional cabins demanded. He checked and rechecked his seals, his chimney, his supplies, and he waited, because waiting was all anyone could do when the mountains decided to show their teeth. The storm arrived on the second day of January 1887 like nothing anyone had seen. Temperature began dropping on New Year's Day, falling steadily until breath froze in clouds that fell like snow. Then the wind came, screaming down from the Arctic. Inside his pyramid, Turner maintained his routine. Small fire, steady and controlled. The warmth held. Outside, through the hide covering his entrance, he could hear wind shrieking like something alive and furious. But inside, temperature stayed comfortable enough for shirt sleeves near the fire, warm enough to sleep without piling on every blanket. He could feel it, though, through the walls, through the very air. This was the test that would prove or destroy everything. 20 miles south, Frank and Charlie Bridger were burning wood as fast as they could split more, their massive fireplace roaring day and night. Their cabin, built the way their father had taught them, fought a losing battle against cold that found every gap between logs, every weakness in the chinking. 15 miles northeast, Thomas Weatherby was learning that even a soldier's discipline couldn't overcome the fundamental inefficiency of heating a large space with a single source when temperatures dropped beyond anything reasonable. He'd wake every 2 hours to feed his fire, desperate to keep it from dying, knowing that if it went out, if he slept too long, he might not wake at all. On the third day, when temperatures had fallen to around 63 below zero, Frank Bridger made a decision that probably saved both their lives. They couldn't keep up with wood consumption. They were burning their entire winter supply at a rate that would leave them with nothing by February, and the cold showed no signs of breaking. Swallowing pride that had sustained 3 generations, Frank saddled his horse and began the brutal ride to Turner's pyramid. The journey nearly killed him. Even bundled in every layer he owned, even stopping every mile to build small fires, the cold was beyond anything imaginable. His beard became solid ice. His eyelashes froze together. When he finally saw the pyramid with smoke rising thin and steady from the apex, he almost wept. That slight trail of smoke meant a small fire. No massive blaze. No desperate consumption of fuel. Just a modest fire in cold that was killing men across the territory. When Turner opened the hide door and warmth poured out, when Frank stumbled inside and felt heat that seemed miraculous, when he stood there in shirt sleeves for the first time in days, while outside his horse stood in unimaginable cold, Frank Bridger understood he'd been wrong. They'd all been wrong. Completely, totally, dangerously wrong. Frank stayed 3 days until the worst broke enough to make the journey back survivable. During that time, the 2 men barely spoke about the pyramid. There was nothing to say. The proof surrounded them. Turner's woodpile showed he'd used perhaps a quarter of what Frank and Charlie had burned. Temperature inside stayed steady with a fire that was almost insultingly small. The comfort was undeniable. Frank slept through the night for the first time in a week. Actually slept rather than waking constantly. On the morning he left, stepping from warmth into cold that hit like a physical blow, Frank paused at the entrance. He looked at Turner. This Pennsylvania carpenter who'd come west and seen what men who'd lived here for decades had missed, and said simply that when spring came, he wanted to understand exactly how this worked. Not to mock, to learn, because their father's way, their grandfather's way, all that traditional wisdom had nearly killed them. And this strange pyramid they'd laughed at had kept Turner not just alive, but comfortable through cold that made traditional construction look like suicide. The deep freeze broke after 5 days, temperatures rising to merely bitter. As the territory assessed damage, stories emerged. 2 trappers found frozen in their cabin up north, their fire gone out. A family at the settlement barely surviving. Children showing signs of frostbite despite being indoors. Thomas Weatherby, exhausted and half-mad from days without real sleep, his winter woodpile depleted to dangerous levels. And then the story of Isaac Turner, who'd sat comfortable in his mocked pyramid while the territory froze, who'd barely touched his wood supply, who'd proven through the cruelest possible test that different wasn't foolish. Different, in this case, had been wisdom. By February, as word spread through every trading post and gathering place, the mockery had transformed. Curiosity, certainly. Respect, grudgingly given but genuine. And requests. Men who'd sneered at Turner's construction 6 months earlier now wanted to see inside. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know if it was too late to modify their own shelters, or if they'd have to wait until spring to build new ones. Turner showed them. He explained the principles in simple terms. Trapped air, small spaces, heat conservation. He didn't claim special knowledge. He just watched and thought and tried something different. That was all. But that had been enough. Over the following years, variations of Turner's pyramid began appearing across the territory. Not everyone adopted the design completely, but elements of it spread like seeds on the wind. Double walls became common. Insulation with natural materials became standard. Smaller, more efficient living spaces gained acceptance. The transition wasn't instant. Traditional ways die hard even when they nearly kill you. But slowly, over seasons and storms, the frontier adapted. Turner's original pyramid stood for nearly 40 years, serving first him, then the family he eventually started after marrying a widow from the settlement, then their children. When it finally came down in the 1920s, dismantled to make way for a more modern home, the timbers were still sound. The moss between the walls still dry and intact. Some of those timbers were saved and used in the new construction, carrying forward a piece of that innovation into another generation. The story of the pyramid and the freeze of 1887 became part of local legend, told and retold around fires and dinner tables. A reminder that survival sometimes required thinking beyond tradition, that observation and courage to act on what you observed could mean the difference between life and death in a land that forgave nothing. Looking back across more than a century, Isaac Turner's pyramid represents something larger than just a clever shelter design. It speaks to the heart of what innovation actually requires. Not formal education or institutional support or permission from authorities, but simple observation, willingness to question assumptions, and courage to act despite mockery. Turner wasn't an engineer. He was a carpenter who'd watched how heat behaved, who'd paid attention to what worked and what didn't, who'd had the stubborn determination to try something different, even when everyone around him said he was wrong. How many times, across how many fields and endeavours, has genuine progress emerged exactly this way? How often has the breakthrough come not from the experts who knew all the traditional answers, but from someone who asked whether those answers were actually solving the problem? The pyramid in Montana Territory proved its worth in the most definitive way possible, through survival when traditional methods failed. The men who'd mocked it had to face not just being wrong, but being wrong about something that nearly cost them their lives. That kind of validation, brutal and undeniable, changed minds faster than any amount of argument ever could. The deeper lesson extends beyond shelter construction into the fundamental challenge of human progress. We build traditions because they work often enough to become trusted, but we sometimes forget that working often enough isn't the same as working optimally, or that conditions change and render old solutions inadequate. The frontier of the 1880s was harsh enough to expose inefficiency quickly and dramatically. A shelter that wasted heat wasn't just inconvenient. It was potentially lethal. That harsh feedback loop forced adaptation in ways that more forgiving environments might not. Turner's observation about heat and space, about the difference between brute force and efficiency, speaks to principles that extend far beyond log structures in Montana. How much of what we do in any field is simply tradition, repeated because that's how it's done, never questioned because it mostly works? How many Isaac Turners are there in every generation, seeing something everyone else has missed, trying to explain it and finding only skepticism, building it anyway, because they can't not build it? And how often do we, like the Bridger brothers and Thomas Weatherby, need the harsh slap of reality before we're willing to admit that the newcomer with the strange ideas might be seeing something we've been blind to all along? These stories from the frontier matter not because we're building log pyramids anymore, but because they show us something essential about human nature, about innovation, about the kind of observation and courage that pushes us forward even when comfort and consensus pull us back. These accounts of frontier ingenuity, of men and women who had to innovate or die, who solved impossible problems with whatever they had available, deserve to be remembered and shared. They remind us that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation when necessity demands it, that wisdom doesn't require formal education or institutional credentials, that paying attention and thinking clearly can matter more than following the established way. If these stories resonate with you, if you find value in understanding how previous generations solved problems we can barely imagine today, consider subscribing to this channel and supporting the work of preserving these narratives. Leave a like if this account moved you or taught you something. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you know similar stories from your own family history or region. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're part of our collective heritage of human problem solving, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative was unacceptable. By engaging with these stories, by keeping them alive and passing them forward, we honor the memory of people like Isaac Turner, who faced the impossible and refused to accept that there wasn't a better way. Every subscription, every comment, every share helps ensure that their ingenuity isn't forgotten, that their lessons continue to inspire and teach. There are countless more stories like this, waiting to be told, waiting to remind us of what humans are capable of when they observe carefully and act courageously. In the end, Isaac Turner's pyramid stands as a testament to a simple but profound truth. Sometimes the fool building the strange structure in the clearing isn't a fool at all. Sometimes he's the only one paying attention. And sometimes when the storm comes and the temperature drops to 63 below, and everything traditional fails, that strange structure is the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. The next time you encounter an idea that seems strange, that challenges conventional wisdom, that makes people laugh or shake their heads, remember the pyramid in Montana Territory. Remember that innovation often looks like madness until the moment it becomes obvious wisdom. And remember Isaac Turner, who built what others mocked and survived what traditional methods could not withstand, proving that observation and courage can triumph over consensus and tradition when the stakes are life itself.